Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Yaana webinar series. Our topic for today is Roaming Impacts 2020 Wireless Evolution and Beyond. We will be discussing evolving technologies such as 5Gs, VoLTE, IoT, and the challenges they present to wholesale roaming teams in managing charging models, deal structures, analysis, and more. I'm Todd Finley. I'm Vice President of Product Management for Yaana Technologies. I want to thank you for joining us today. For today's webinar, Ava Gildem will be our guest. The presentation portion of the webinar will last approximately 20 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. During the presentation, we invite you to submit your questions using the application's Q&A functionality. We will review your questions at the end. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Yaana. Yaana is a Silicon Valley-based organization. We provide expertise and software solutions to telecommunication companies and law enforcement intelligence agencies around the world. Our products specifically focus on security, legal compliance, analytics, and roaming management solutions. The company has been around for about nearly 20 years. We're based in Silicon Valley, California, I believe I said, and we have offices around the world. If you're interested in talking with us about any of our products, we would direct you to our website, Yaana.com. But we would invite you after this call to contact us if you have any questions about our services, our products, or topics that we're going over today. So I would like to introduce now Ava Gildem, our speaker for the webinar. Ava is Vice President of NewString, our roaming management product. She's a thought leader within the mobile analytics. Ava specializes in roaming financial management and optimization. She has nearly 20 years experience in the wireless industry, working with data and financial clearing globally. Ava resides in Denmark and is commonly available around Europe for speaking engagements and discussions about roaming. So I would like to turn it over to Ava. Good afternoon, Ava.
Good afternoon, Todd. Hi. So thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining. Today we're going to be talking about how selected technology evolutions and developments may be impacting roaming. Todd indicated this initially. The intention is not for a discussion on technical capabilities directly, but rather the technology, how it's relevant for roaming, charging related to roaming, and ultimately getting to the point where you are able to assess financial impacts. You can consider sometimes, if you look at roaming deployment as a cycle, if you're looking at it from a monetization or a commercialization perspective, the deployment of a technology is typically initially a national matter. However, considerations for data availability, transparency, information that you need from your roaming partners in order to be able to manage this need to be taken into consideration. Once you understand what data availability you have, you want to take the next step and look at how these services should be charged. And this is obviously dependent on the data availability, the options for differentiation, if they're there, and the kinds of traffic that the different technologies will generate is also obviously going to be a little bit different. Once you've looked at charging models, either based on what is available within the industry, the wholesale pricing structure today, or based on different pricing schemes that can be either applicable to all or that can be gauged at a bilateral level, you need to then look at the ability to monitor, to track performance, certainly financial performance, as it obviously ultimately to a certain extent comes down to some kind of a profit and loss evaluation. Why are we doing all this? At the end of the day, we want to drive a sensible business model. Now, the technologies that can impact roaming can be both fairly new, like 5G. They can be mature, like Wi-Fi, or maybe somewhere in between, like IoT or LTE, 4G, VoLTE, and so on. I've tried to categorize these selected techs based on their maturity, meaning how fixed are the standardizations related to the deployments from a national perspective, their commercial availability, how common are deployments seen from a global perspective, and certainly as well seen from a roaming relevance perspective. Some technologies may be extremely exciting and fun to look at, but you still need to consider what is the application, what is the relevance of the use cases, the services that are being offered from a roaming perspective. Given the maturity of the technologies listed here today, and of course there are many more, I will try to focus on LTE, IoT, and Wi-Fi roaming. 5G, as exciting as it may be, may not be ready for a mass roaming consideration at this point in time. So why don't we start and have a little bit of a look at LTE. Now, if we look at LTE seen from a number perspective, it is broadly launched today. There are approximately 720 operators that have launched LTE. They cover 219 countries, which results in approximately 84% of the population. If we look at VoLTE, or voice and video over LTE specifically, the number isn't as big, but still we have 171 operators, 86 countries, and devices, approximately 1,700 that support VoLTE today. Now, the purpose of LTE for roaming is often quoted as being speed and stability. You want to be able to offer the same kind of quality to your subscribers, whether they are within your own network or abroad, and probably this has also become an expectation. Now, LTE is not new. I mean, it started 15 years ago with the first trials in Asia. The standard was probably locked in around 2008, and the first commercial launches in 2009. But still, 10 years later, it's not being a new technology, but it's certainly still something that is being rolled out from a roaming perspective. If we look at the case that is VoLTE specifically, some of the challenges that we've seen on roaming deployments and trying to look at how to commercialize this kind of traffic, there are certainly options for identifying the traffic in the TAP standards. There are QCIs that are identified and reserved for this kind of a traffic. There's also a dedicated APN that can be used to identify this traffic specifically. Our experience is, or my experience is, I have seen that not necessarily are these selections, these options aligned across the industry. So how you identify this traffic within your TAP files may not be the same way that it is identified with your roaming partners. So this creates a little bit of a challenge if you want to go to the level where you're differentiating pricing for this traffic. And why shouldn't you? I mean, you are offering a different level of quality, and obviously it could be interesting to look at whether that quality can justify some kind of a price differentiation, either when you are allowing others to use your network, but also if you're going to be supporting your subscribers and using this in an outbound scenario. Part of LTE is also LTE-M, which is the M2M extension of LTE, allowing mass traffic. And this is unfortunately not as easy to identify. As it is today, there is no unique identifier for LTE-M. You can, if you have the capability, identify the traffic through traffic patterns, which we've seen some operators work with, but it certainly adds a specific challenge if you want to differentiate this kind of traffic. But certainly there is an element within LTE-M and the market that it addresses that makes it interesting to look at. There's a lot of potential. if we're talking about moving a little bit forward, moving out of the LTE towards IoT, the expectations are, for example, GSMA is stating that they expect 3.5 billion cellular IoT connections in 2025. I've even seen research material indicating 27 billion things in quotation marks that will be connected by 2025. So regardless of challenges for identifying this traffic, it's definitely worth looking into simply from a potential perspective. So let's try to move on to IoT. Having worked with roaming for many years, it's taken me some time to adapt to the IoT abbreviation. It doesn't necessarily mean interoperator tariff. If we're looking at a definition, and this is how the GSMA defines an IoT, it's the Internet of Things is an environment in which objects, animals, or people are provided with unique identifiers and the ability to transfer data over a network without requiring human-to-computer interaction. So this is a really broad definition, obviously, that covers many different types of services, many different types of verticals, and there are also different technical options for implementation that provide different possibilities for differentiating pricing and applying rates to the traffic that you have. Now, LTE-M, which we just briefly touched on, compared to narrowband IoT, and maybe as it's stated here, it shouldn't actually be one versus the other. They are, in fact, complementary in a sense. They address different kinds of use cases. Both are 3GPP standards, and while they both cater to addressing coverage, and this can be within in-building, basements, subways, and so on, there are different elements from a technical perspective that make them relevant for different kinds of use cases. Now, I won't go into detail with what let's say, technology can be used for what kind of specific services, but bearing in mind that you need to be able to identify the traffic if you're going to differentiate your charging principles and the business cases that apply, and that will be different whether you are looking at LTE-M as an implementation or whether you're looking at narrowband IoT. What applies to both is, of course, that dependent on your ability to successfully differentiate, the charging options can vary. You can look at the expected traffic patterns and consider that obviously different methods will work for different types of traffic. You could consider using traditional price per usage. You could also look at active devices and decide that or determine that the best approach to pricing this traffic is having a monthly, you could even call it a subscription based on X amount of active devices on a monthly or on a daily basis. It could also be that you need to be significantly more detailed in your pricing parameter selection and look at each individual device and determine which thresholds, volume thresholds, are applicable. And this will, of course, be very much dependent on the kind of vertical that you're addressing and what the travel pattern of that particular device or unit is. It could be that it's a per call volume, or it could also be that the right approach to charging is looking at how many sessions, so not the length of the sessions or the size of the sessions, but rather how many sessions are generated by each of the devices that could be relevant. And in general, what I would always consider if you're looking at IoT for that matter, is how movable are the devices that you are looking to include into the IoT deployment. So I mentioned that IoT is fairly mature. It may not be 100% relevant for all cases for roaming, but it is certainly commercially available today. There are, if you look at the overview here, a world map of different coverages when it comes to IoT deployments. You could even say that there seems to be a regional preference for one versus the other, meaning LTE-M versus narrowband IoT. but you do also see that there are selected markets that are adopting both technologies in order to be able to cater to the different verticals that are relevant. For example, for those for those devices that actually travel. Let's try to look at a different case. So moving away from technologies that are to a certain extent still fairly new to something that you could say is old. So looking at something completely different, Wi-Fi and roaming. Now Wi-Fi is not a new technology, but maybe there is a new way that some are selecting to use Wi-Fi when it comes to roaming scenarios. The case here is that a lot of potential traffic is actually being diverted or taken away from roaming. Again, not new. But if you look at some of these statistics, I think it's a little bit surprising. Not so much that there's a lot of usage on Wi-Fi, but that some of the destinations that you see where Wi-Fi is still being applied are actually within what I would call a roam-like home or an EU footprint. So even though I think it's noteworthy, for example, that you look at Germany or UK or France, the ones that are listed here, that there is a significant amount of roaming traffic that is captured by Wi-Fi. Now, as a user myself, I would probably not look at Wi-Fi in these destinations because I now have roaming for free, so why would I consider that? Again, it's still something that seems to be an option. I would have expected these volumes these values to decrease, but as it's been looking so far, it has not had a huge impact. And in fact, we're seeing another trend where, for example, voice over Wi-Fi is being introduced. So basically replacing traditional roaming with voice over Wi-Fi. I think it's pretty impressive that there are actually 74 operators that have done this and that it's relevant in 43 countries. Things to consider here, again, this is not a new technology, but the question is, are you losing revenue to Wi-Fi? Or the question is probably more, how much are you losing to Wi-Fi? And consider what the cost of wholesale roaming is in some destinations, and consider engaging partners to include Wi-Fi coverage, not as a replacement, but rather as a supplement. There's also the option of using this to offload from a cost or from a congestion perspective. And again, not necessarily a new technology, as I've mentioned a few times, but something that we see being considered in a different way that will potentially allow for a different market or different approach to the roaming architecture in general. So we've gone through some tech characteristics, data identification, and charging options. And considering the options that are available, you of course need to look also at a business model and how are you going to monetize this. It should be noted that it's not a matter, or I don't see this as a selection of one versus the other. It's more of a complementary decision or a complementary approach. You need to consider how to address each data flow and consider what the optimal charging approach is based on the data, how it can be identified, and what information is available. Now, we've already talked about traditional roaming. Everyone is familiar with it. Bulks, this can be different kinds of commitments that you use to entice the commercial model. IMSI level pricing, subscriber level pricing, whether the subscriber is a device with an EMI number or whether it is a person behind it. And why not even consider advertising? If we're going into different kinds of approaches, maybe you could even do content inclusion within your roaming. That could be a whole new element to consider. And as we talked about with regards to LTE or VoLTE, quality of service. There's many options that are available, and one doesn't necessarily match each technology, but the question is really, how are you going to combine all of these different elements? The question is also, what is the business driver behind this? What are you improving, facilitating? What's the cost? And obviously, what's the potential revenue, and does it align with your overall strategy? How are you going to evaluate the business drivers? What information do you need? At least you need an understanding of expected traffic patterns, estimations on numbers and types of devices, expected adoption rates, how many are going to use, or how much is the service going to be used. And in some cases, the challenge is addressing a threat could be taking traffic away, meaning that it impacts your technology investment and the ROI, the return on investment on the technologies that you've chosen. Other cases, it can be quite opposite. It's an opportunity to capture a market where there's more traffic that you can basically utilize. From what we've gone through today, there are a lot of options, and surely there will be more in the future. Blockchain may come along anytime soon and disrupt the entire roaming architecture as we know it today. I've even heard or seen recently that there's talk about a telco currency, so a special cryptocurrency for wholesale interoperability, difficult word to say, that could also potentially disrupt everything. As I see it, in order to prepare for these future options and to analyze options already available today, I think it's important to be able to take a holistic approach. You should look at multiple data sources that are available today, combine them, aggregate them across technologies. Here, the data sources listed are only few, so we have good old TAP, we have CDRs, we have Billing and Charging Evolution, BCE, the latest initiative, or one of the latest initiatives from the GSMA as to alternative ways of exchanging billing information, radio access technology, diameter, signaling, SS7, obviously there are quite a few. And the requirement or the challenge becomes, how are you going to be processing this data? How are you able to aggregate and consolidate? The relationship that you have with a roaming partner will include many different business cases that you need to be able to evaluate and assess for roaming going forward. Now, I myself am not really a technical person, but I do need to be able to access and analyze relevant data from a business perspective. I want to understand the revenues and cost to convert the tech into financial numbers. Traditional roaming is being combined with all these new data streams and then changing the infrastructure. The focus should be to ensure that the data is available in a way that the business side can analyze, not necessarily a technical approach, but a market-driven one. I believe the wholesale roaming market more and more is becoming commercially driven, is not just about the technical capability of providing IoT connections. It's really it's more about, or it's getting to be much more about the overall commercial viability. And to get the answers for that, you really need to be able to have the ability to analyze. So that was the topics or the conclusion of what we wanted to cover today. I am happy to take any questions at this point in time. If you have something you would like to have elaborated, there's a Q&A option within the webinar where you can pose questions if you have any that you would like to ask. Okay, I have a question that asks about covering pricing options for IoT. Are there some verticals that lend themselves to one model over another? Yes, I believe there are. The traffic patterns of verticals will of course be different. You will have some verticals or some markets where there is a constant and fairly stable usage. It will not be a high usage as we see it in traditional roaming, but it will certainly be a usage that is identifiable. There will also be other verticals, mainly related to these low power wide area devices that really only need to to send a little ping that they're alive once in a while to certain centralized locations, where you may have a challenge with regards to volumes being so low that you may actually have a higher signaling cost than you have within the roaming, so you actually have a negative business case. But also I've heard cases where the volumes are so low that the amount of decimals, even in byte size, is just not significant. So the values are basically coming in as zeros. So this is well, maybe not necessarily a pricing option, but something to consider to avoid what would actually be a revenue leakage. So key to pricing options, or at least to evaluate what works best for IoT pricing, Internet of Things pricing, would be looking at the expected traffic pattern and deciding based on that pattern. So thank you for that question. Are there any other questions? Okay, I have another question coming in. The question is related to summing up to being zero. Do some operators choose to opt out of low volume IoT deals, or are they commercially still worthwhile for other purposes? Is it easy to analyze this within the first launch of the year? So given that the values are coming in as zero, of course, you need to use alternative data sources than, for example, the standards coming in order to be able to look into low volume IoT deals. I have not seen that these kind of deals are being discarded for this reason. More, it's a matter of looking at, well, maybe you shouldn't be charging by the volume, but you should be charging by the number of devices instead. So if the volume is expected to be low, and this is something that I would expect that you would be able to evaluate when you look into the specific IoT deal that, or the traffic that you're going to cover, that you would understand, or at least be able to analyze the traffic pattern. Obviously, the longer of a period you have, you start to get historical data to analyze on, but certainly it would be something that you can look at within the first year of launch, assuming that there's an uptake. I mean, IoT is interesting for roaming because even though it's exciting and the potential is so big, at the end of the day, there are some of these devices that simply don't move. If they don't move, they're not relevant for roaming, really. I hope that answered the question. If not, please please feel free to ask again. Are there any more questions? I don't know whether anyone on the webinar have experience with their own launches and whether it's IoT or struggles with differentiated pricing. You're more than welcome to share if you like.
So Ava, what we're going to do is, if we get additional questions that we aren't able to answer here, we'll try and respond back to the participants after the webinar.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. On behalf of Yaana, I want to thank all the attendees for joining today's discussion. We will be sending an email out with a recording of the presentation within the next 24 hours. If you wish to listen to it again, or if you want to share it with your friends and coworkers. I would also ask you to keep your eyes open. We will be sending out announcements about an upcoming webinar that Yaana will be hosting next month concerning 5G and the effects on telecommunications. Otherwise, thank you very much for participating today, and we hope you've enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.